Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Attachment Network of Manitoba's podcast, Reframing Addiction, the Crisis of Disconnection. My name is Michael Redhead Champagne, and I'll be your host for today, and I'm excited to have a very special guest.
Tim Fletcher, and I am the founder of Finding Freedom 15 years ago. I've worked in the addiction field for over 17 years, and in the last 10 plus years have really focused on addiction and its connection to complex trauma or complex PTSD. And so we run a Friday night support group that teaches the public and provides support to people with addiction and trauma. And we run a treatment center called React, and we run an online treatment center called Lift.
Very busy, and I'm not surprised at all, and I'm excited to learn more about all of the great work that you do. Thank you so much for being with us today, Tim.
Thank you.
Today we are reframing addiction, talking about the crisis of disconnection. The purpose of our podcast series is to explore addiction and healing through the lens of trauma and disconnection. As our communities have become more and more disconnected from healthy relationships with family, friends, and community, addictions unfortunately have also become more widespread in our lives. We define trauma, for the sake of our podcast, as the lack of safety, connection, and healthy relationships. The crisis of disconnection is the trauma that we are facing in our communities, families, and in our friendships, even within ourselves. We'll be exploring how the trauma of disconnection impacts addiction and answering the question of how we can reconnect in ways to assist individuals, families, and entire communities that are struggling with addiction. So we're going to jump right into it today, Tim. And from your perspective, please let our listeners know, what does addiction look like in Manitoba, and how has the landscape changed in the past 10 years?
I would say like 17 years ago when I started, crack was the main issue that everybody was talking about. At that time, we didn't even have heroin in Manitoba. But in the last 10 years with meth and then fentanyl, now Purple Down, all of that, it has changed a lot. To me, it's still the same underlying issues, but some of the consequences of the drugs now being used, meth and fentanyl, we're getting new levels of overdoses. We're getting new levels of psychosis that last even after a person has quit using. So it definitely is very challenging, and it's growing.
Wow. Would you think that when we think about trauma, when we think about disconnection, what do you think, what is the relationship between trauma and addiction?
Okay. So what I tell my clients is complex trauma is not being safe, but for a child who is in pain or has a need or a problem and they reach out to connect with the authorities of their life, but the authorities aren't there for them or the authorities abuse them, then really the trauma is I'm wanting to connect so somebody will help me through this, but I can't. And that is traumatizing because now I feel all alone with this pain, with this unmet need against a big bad world with nobody to keep me safe. And so the child goes into survival mode, which is fight, flight. And if they're too little to fight back and they're too little to run away, they go to the third option, which is freeze. Let's not feel anymore. Let's disconnect. And so once they find drugs and alcohol, they found the perfect survival tool. Now I can fight, flight, freeze better than any other thing that I've ever tried. And so addiction becomes a solution to their trauma problem.
Wow. And something I'm noticing between all the folks that we've been talking to on this podcast is everyone always begins by talking about childhood. So is addiction always relating to childhood or just usually?
Well, the statistics that were started kind of by Gabor Mate's research in Vancouver is that there's definitely a link between what happens in childhood and whether a person ends up an addict or not. And AFM here in Manitoba says 97% of addicts have childhood trauma. So what I say to people is, it's the formation of who we are, how we see ourselves, how we cope, how we relate, that is formed in childhood. You might not have had super significant painful traumas until later in life, but how you cope with those traumas was already formed in early childhood. So that's one way of looking at it. But sadly, for most of the people who end up in addiction, their trauma started in infancy or early childhood.
So other than kind of those experiences in childhood, what are the other main root causes of addiction? Is it mostly pain?
Well, I think if you want to, yeah, so if you look at complex trauma, one way to look at it is the child can't resolve their problems. They can't resolve the pain. So they've got all these painful emotions, hurt and fear and anger, all of that. They're trying to fix them, but they can't. And the big people in their life aren't fixing them for them. So what do you do then with unresolved? Well, you have to find a way to medicate it, to numb it, to disconnect from it. So really, one way to look at addiction is it's an escape from pain. It's a way to get out of pain. And it's not just from being hurt. You have pain also from, I don't like my personality. I've been told I'm too shy, and all the outgoing people seem to have the friends. So I hate that I'm not shy. Oh, alcohol, that makes me outgoing. So there, I found another solution. So you have unresolved pain, but you also have in complex trauma, unresolved needs not met, acceptance, fitting in, belonging. And so alcohol, drugs seems to meet that need and provide the solution, because now I fit in, now I'm outgoing, now I'm the life of the party. So it's getting you out of pain, and it seems to meet very basic needs.
So thank you very much for that. I wonder about Manitoba, Winnipeg. Do you agree that addiction has become an epidemic in our community?
Yes, I would say so. And it's not just because of drugs, alcohol. There's also what we call the process addictions, which are your gambling, your food, pornography, sex, all of those other types of activity type addictions. And I think COVID has really ramped up a lot of that stuff. But I think how I would frame it is complex trauma is growing in our culture, and therefore we should expect that addictions will be growing. And I do think it is getting to a point of being an epidemic. They used to say 10% of the population were addicts. I don't hear anybody saying that anymore. So if you look at Winnipeg, a city of 700,000, well, that would say 70,000 Winnipeggers are addicts. But I think most of us would say if you add process addictions and all of that, there's a lot more than 70,000 people who are struggling with addictions.
Yeah, I know that for the experiences that I've seen in the community. I appreciate the listing that you just gave of all the varieties of addictions that can happen beyond just drugs, because I think often people isolate it when we say addiction. They only think about drugs, and they don't think about people that need to drink coffee all the time, or people that have to have sugar or smokes, or, you know, like, and our relatives that are using substances are, you know, they're coping with the tools that they have available, which maybe it's, you know, crystal meth, maybe it's one of these other harder, you know, more frowned upon illegal drugs. But like, I feel like it's the same thing as wealthy people in the privacy of their own homes, having a glass of wine or a Tylenol or whatever it may be to deal with their pain and frustration.
Exactly.
So you touched on it already, but I'd like to maybe learn a little bit more about how the COVID-19 pandemic has interacted with the epidemic of addiction in our communities. And like, what has the pandemic done?
Well, it's definitely made everything worse. if I could give another piece to this whole puzzle, so complex trauma resolves an unresolved unmet needs, unresolved pain, but it also results in anxiety, depression, mental health type issues that come out of complex trauma. And more it's being understood that some mental health issues aren't just genetic. There's a trauma component in what has caused the brain to respond the way it has. And so if you just take depression and anxiety, just about everybody with complex trauma has anxiety issues and depression issues. It's just a given. So what's happened now when you're isolated because of COVID, you can't connect, and we need connection to help us with our mental health, our emotional equilibrium, to help us fight depression, to help us feel like we have a purpose, that we are useful. And then we're sitting in this unknown and we're bored, and that just feeds into a whole bunch of dark stuff in a lot of people from trauma. And their brain goes back to, well, I need to feel better now. And so now you get the increase in addiction that takes place. So COVID has resulted in an increase in isolation, lack of connection, which has led to an increase in depression, anxiety, which has led to an increase in addiction issues. So
it's like dominoes.
It is. It's a domino thing. Yeah.
So you offer a variety of different services and supports. How has COVID impacted the way that you do service delivery?
So we had to shut down our in-person for a while, but it was actually a blessing because it forced us to put it online. And our online treatment center now is spreading, and we got people all over the world who are now taking it just because they've heard we're offering it. So that's been a positive. We had to shut down for 5 months, I believe, the in-person, but then because we're deemed an essential service, we were allowed to have 5 people per classroom. And so we were able to start in person again back in August. And now we're up to the 10 people. So thankfully we've been able to do that. And it's really met a very important need.
Wow, that's really great. So how do you support people's, you've been describing it this entire time, but what are the main elements in supporting people's healing journeys? Like, what are the main planks?
Yeah. So if you look at, again, complex trauma, where you had to freeze in order to survive, and you had to, if you look at the tools that you needed to survive, don't trust anybody, be a control freak, learn to manipulate people. Well, those were survival tools, but they sure mess up adult relationships if you ever want a healthy one. And then you've got all this pain and unresolved anger. And so what happens when you disconnect is that all operates at a subconscious level. You're not even aware of all of the stuff that happens inside of you, the stuff you do to cope, relate, etc. So the first step is growing self-awareness, starting to understand why I do what I do and the patterns I follow when I get triggered in certain things. So we spend a lot of time psychoeducational, understanding how trauma gave me survival tools that are not healthy tools for healthy living. And then there's a healing element because a lot of trauma was very wounding. And so there's a lot of childhood wounds that were denied, minimized, you were shamed for, punished for, that have never been validated, and you've never had safe people that you could heal. So there's a healing thing. And then there's building a trusting support network. And that's scary, but what you realize is you can't do this alone. You do need support, but I have to learn to find safe people, number one, and then be able to trust them. And so we call it, we provide a surrogate family where people can begin that journey of building this safe network of support. And then you got to start to develop some healthy relationships. And that becomes a key piece. So those are all very important pieces. Now, having said all of that, you still got to be clean and sober, because if you go back to that way of coping, you'll stop growing, because your brain says, why do I need to learn these other tools? I'm back to this tool that seems to work. And you're going to constantly have triggers that are going to happen. And so you're going to have to learn to manage a lot of that trigger stuff so that you don't go back to your relapse drug, because that's where your brain wants to go as soon as you're triggered and in pain again. So we try to provide all of that.
So you need a good safety plan, really.
Exactly. So there's a definitely safety plan, a kind of a recovery plan that everybody needs. And then for most people, when you've only learned survival tools, they don't even know what healthy tools look like. And so it's, yeah, help me understand how I'm screwed up, but please help me understand what healthy looks like.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you.
And help me know how to get to there. Yes. So give me the tools for that.
I think that's great. It's exactly the kind of stuff that I love to hear, because it's not enough to be able to say that this is the bad thing. Like, tell me what the good thing is and how to get there.
Exactly.
So that's great to look at that individual level. And you mentioned that people have to build like that family, or in some cases a surrogate family, right? If your actual, connections are broken or interrupted with your actual family, then you get to build the family of choice, or your, in my Cree language, in Innu, there's the word wakotawin, and it means kinship. So it's essentially like, family. And so I love what you're saying. And it makes me wonder, what is the role that communities play in supporting folks, and like entire family groups? Like, what do communities need to do?
Okay. So I think as a culture, we've become very much addicted to a quick fix model. So here's the Band-Aid for your symptoms. Let's just put the Band-Aid on and you're fixed. So you got an eating disorder. Let's just get you on a good eating, keeping track of calories, all that kind of stuff. And so I think that's actually done a disservice to people, because they need to get to the roots. What is really the root cause of this problem? So don't just try to fix the symptoms. Help me fix the cancer underneath. And so I think the culture still needs to be educated that we have to stop putting Band-Aids on everything, because it doesn't work ultimately. We really have to start to understand how the complex trauma, how that stuff has changed the person deep down and resulted in unhealthy stuff. And I think there's a gradual shift beginning to happen as people understand it, but we still got a long way to go. And then there's still a lot of shame type stigma stuff. Oh, you're an addict. Oh, you got mental health issues. Something's wrong with you. Oh, you were in jail. Oh, you're a terrible person. And it's to be able to realize, okay, whoa, let's stop judging the people and let's start understanding the people, why they do what they do. Because it doesn't help them to be judged. It helps them only if they can begin to understand it themselves. And then we have to provide safe places for people where they can open up, do this type of therapy without being judged, without being criticized. And so that to me is such an important thing. Is I get asked by clients all the time, where can I go to find groups of safe people? And I go, well, that's a very good question. I wish I had an easy answer for you, because sadly, a lot of the groups of our culture today that are kind of open to the public aren't safe for people with trauma and addiction. And so it's really, I think the culture needs to do a lot of changing to get past that kind of mindset.
So you mentioned that some of your work is bringing people together on Friday nights. Now, right. I have an attachment myself to Friday nights. And I would just be curious to hear a little bit about why Friday nights. Isn't that a little bit of an inconvenient time? Quotation.
Well, it was really interesting because when we chose Friday nights, all the normies, if I can use that term,
What's a
actually,
normie? I don't know if I've ever heard that before. Normie?
normie's a non-addict. Um, so all the normies are going, why Friday nights? Friday nights is the beginning of the weekend. And I go, but Friday night to an addict was the worst night of the week as far as that's party night. And so for a person in recovery to have something on a Friday night going into the weekend to give them a bit of a shot in the arm and support was essential. So we started 15 years ago on Friday nights, and we now have about 1,000 people each Friday night that are part of what we do, because they need it going into the weekend.
That makes a lot of sense. And I also wonder as well, I know in a lot of my community organizing, there was, for years at a time, we would have things on Friday nights and then also things again on Saturdays at lunch, right, which again would maybe look a little bit strange to normies. But from a person who is, wanting to keep themselves busy, wanting exactly. to be around good people. I was told by people that having the Friday night and the Saturday at lunch stuff really gave them a connection to healthy people and a reason after the connection on Friday night when they go home, not to get super screwed up, because then when they show up on Saturday, then they kind of don't feel as present or as good. And so that's like that sandwich strategy. I don't know if that's a real thing.
Yep. Oh, that's very good.
So for community resources out there that want to be a part of the solution, but don't know how, what would you say to them? What would you recommend on some tips for community resources to actually be healthy? Because I think there might be community resources out there that think they're doing a good job, but maybe with a little bit of advice from a Tim like you, they might be able to do a little bit more.
Right. I spend more and more of my time training people, community resources, just to understand this whole world of complex trauma. And it's very different from just the PTSD world. There's a whole huge dimension to it that's very different from that world. And people need to understand it. So the PTSD world is one-time danger. Complex trauma is what about a child though who lives in constant danger, who never feels safe? So that totally changes them as a person, because now your survival tools are your only tools. In a PTSD world, you use survival tools for an hour, then you put them away and go back to healthy tools. But not in a complex trauma world. You don't even pick up healthy tools, because then you wouldn't be able to survive. So what I find is as I train people who are already working with people with trauma, addiction, mental health, it just helps them better understand the people they're working with, gives them a greater empathy for them, but a greater ability to know where to point them as far as where the deepest healing needs to happen, where the tools need to be learned, etc. So I just think we're very much still in an education phase, and the community people reach out for some of that education. It's so important to become effective in this work.
It's so true. And we really have to, I find, as someone who's been so involved in a lot of community resources, and a lot of the work I do takes that harm reduction lens and welcomes in people that maybe they're using drugs, maybe they're, what have you. And those folks really crave additional spaces. And I really appreciate what you said about folks asking you about where can I find safe people, because I think I often get that question as well. And so maybe another, I guess that's the tip, one of the tips as well, right? For people to make sure that in the services that you provide, you're being safe people.
Exactly.
Are there any organizations like grassroots groups or maybe even some stuff that you folks are doing now that's new to treat addiction, or things that are exciting that you want to give some shout outs to?
Yeah. So I started over 17 years ago in Manitoba addiction treatment world. And then Gabor Mate came out with his understanding that everybody with addiction that he dealt with in Vancouver had childhood trauma. And that started in Manitoba addiction treatment world. We need to be trauma informed. And so there was this whole bit of let's be trauma informed, let's understand. But what I saw was nobody was willing to radically change their program. We were still kind of treating addicts the same number of weeks, the same basic material. And so in my mind was, okay, somebody has to step out and start treating the trauma. Because if we truly believe that's the root cause of addiction, then if we don't start truly providing a treatment center for that, people aren't going to really get the help they need with their addiction. And so part of the realization was that the success rate of treatment centers was less than 10% as far as people staying clean. And so 5 years ago, we moved to start REACT, which stands for Recovery Education for Addiction and Complex Trauma. And it was our attempt to kind of enter the treatment world with a new model that would deal with the trauma piece. We'd still teach about addiction, relapse prevention, all of those things, but we would focus mainly on the trauma piece. And we've seen the success rate of our clients go way above the 10%. And so to me, it just says, wow, when you deal with the root cause, it does make a difference. So we've just been kind of blown away by how effective it has been. And I think what we're starting to see now is we're getting requests from all over the world. Can we borrow your material? Can we use your model? Because we've seen the effectiveness of it. So I guess you would say Winnipeg was a grassroots organization that said, let's do addiction treatment a different way. And we're seeing the positive results of that. Wow.
Thank you very much for sharing that. That's really awesome. And since we're on a roll here of talking about the solutions, my favorite part of our conversation is what we're about to say, because we're in the dream section here.
Okay.
And the question is, if money wasn't an issue, if there were no financial barriers, what kind of changes would you want to see today?
Okay. So one of the things that was really debilitating for the treatment centers of Manitoba everywhere was, if we're effectively going to treat trauma in addicts, we need a program that's potentially a year long, even longer. But the government's not going to fund a year-long program for clients, especially if it's residential, et cetera. And it was based on the research that when you've developed, so I use the illustration of a person who's rode their bicycle for 40 years. So you turn your handlebars to the right and you go to the right, and your brain circuit is so reinforced that you can be talking to a friend, you can be looking around, but you turn to the right because you're going to the right and it's subconscious. They actually did research, a study, where they made a bicycle, when you turn to the right, you actually went left. And they told the people, here's the new bicycle. You're going to turn to the right, but go left. In 1 nanosecond, they got the concept. They understood, oh yeah, okay, turn right, but go left. It took 6 months to a year to do that automatically, because it takes that long for the brain to retrain itself.
Because you got to unlearn too.
Exactly. You got to unlearn and then build a new circuit. And so if money wasn't an obstacle, what I think we need an in-depth treatment program where they learn about trauma, deal with the painful parts of dealing with trauma, learn the new tools, but then they need a new place to live for a while where they can put into practice a new lifestyle. So I would love to see a year-long plus program where people could really relearn how to live in a healthy way, as well as healing from the past. So, yeah.
I love that. That's really great. And I think that's a beautiful note for us to come to a conclusion on. And I want to just take a moment on behalf of the Attachment Network. I think you've given us a lot to think about in terms of reframing addiction and thinking about the crisis of disconnection in a different way. I want to give you an opportunity to share any final thoughts or last words before we wrap it up here today.
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to share. I was just sharing with some people today that I can't think of a more fulfilling job to do than what I do. And a lot of people in the helping profession, they work with people and they see some results, but they're limited. They're not very often. I get to see people changing every day in positive ways. And just to watch that, it's like it's a butterfly coming out of a cocoon every day. And so to me, when we really start to get to the core issues and help people heal and grow there, we start seeing lives transformed. And that's really what we're all after. And so it's just great to be part of it.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. On behalf of Attachment Network and everyone listening, thanks for the great work that you do. Here's to another 17 years of revolution and building relationships and everything that you do. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Take care and talk to you again.
Okay.